The central Andes rise gradually from the plains of western Argentina, before lifting into a long barrier of stone and ice along the border with Chile. The transition is slow at first. Brown foothills become exposed ridge. Air thins with elevation. Vegetation recedes. By late spring, snow remains fixed in the shadows of the higher slopes. In October, the season is unsettled. Warm air from lower latitudes collides with cold systems moving across the mountains. Clouds gather quickly. Visibility can narrow without warning. At higher altitudes, wind reshapes the snow into hard drifts and shallow crusts. Sound carries poorly in the open terrain. Distances are difficult to judge. Much of this region is uninhabited. There are no roads across the upper valleys. No permanent structures, only rock, ice, and the slow movement of glaciers pressing through the passes. The ground is uneven and fractured, cut by crevasses that remain hidden beneath thin layers of snow at more than 3,500 meters above sea level. The body reacts quietly to the lack of oxygen. Movement becomes deliberate. Breathing deepens. Simple tasks require time. Water freezes at night, even in spring. From above, the landscape appears uniform. White slopes merge into one another. Valleys look similar. Landmarks are scarce. In poor weather, the horizon disappears entirely, leaving only cloud and light. It is a place that does not resist or assist. It simply exists, indifferent to passage. In October 1972, an aircraft would cross this barrier, following a routine route between Uruguay and Chile, entering this high terrain as countless flights had done before. Montevideo in the early 1970s was a coastal capital with a modest pace. Streets near the Rio de la Plata carried buses and small cars. Neighborhoods were schools, churches, and sports clubs formed the center of daily life. Among these institutions was Stella Maris College, a private Catholic school operated by the Irish Christian Brothers. From it came the Old Christians Club rugby team, composed largely of former students in their late teens and early 20s. Rugby occupied much of their free time. Training sessions were scheduled after classes and work. Matches were arranged with clubs in Argentina and Chile. Travel for sport was common and practical rather than exceptional. The players were not professionals. Most were students of engineering, medicine, or business. Others worked in family companies. They lived at home or with friends. Their lives were structured and predictable, defined by study, training, and weekend games. In October 1972, the team planned a short trip to Santiago, Chile, for an exhibition match. The journey had been postponed earlier in the year due to cost and scheduling. When a charter option became available through the Uruguayan Air Force, seats were offered not only to players but also to relatives and supporters. Parents, siblings, and friends joined the group. The flight became partly athletic travel and partly social excursion. In total, 40 passengers boarded, along with 5 crew members. The ages varied, but most were young adults. Several had never crossed the Andes before. For many it was simply a brief trip across the mountains, expected to last a few days before returning home. Their luggage was light: sports bags, jackets, small gifts for hosts in Santiago. Nothing suggested prolonged absence. Photographs taken before departure show ordinary scenes: teammates standing close together on the airport tarmac, jackets open against the spring air, some smiling, some distracted, waiting to board. There was no sense of departure beyond routine travel. The journey was considered straightforward, familiar, and temporary. The aircraft assigned to the charter was a Fairchild FH227D, a twin-engine turboprop built for short regional routes. It was operated by the Uruguayan Air Force and used regularly for military transport and civilian charters. The design was practical rather than specialized. High wings allowed stability at lower speeds. The engines were reliable at moderate altitudes. The cabin was narrow, with seats arranged in simple rows and limited insulation against cold. Flights between Montevideo and Santiago were common but required careful planning. The Andes formed the only significant obstacle. Aircraft typically crossed through established passes, following radio beacons and air traffic control instructions from Argentina and Chile. Weather often dictated delays. Cloud cover and turbulence could obscure terrain and reduce visual references. On the 12th of October 1972, Flight 571 departed Montevideo in the afternoon. The crew included an experienced Air Force pilot, a co-pilot who was accumulating hours in command training, and 3 additional personnel. The flight plan called for a stop in Mendoza, Argentina, to refuel before continuing west across the mountains into Chilean airspace. Conditions over the Andes were unsettled. Reports indicated cloud layers and strong winds at altitude. Such systems were not unusual in spring. Standard procedure allowed crews to navigate through them using instruments and timing between known waypoints. After refueling in Mendoza, the aircraft remained overnight due to weather. The following day, the 13th of October, the crew prepared for the second leg of the journey. To those on board, The aircraft was ordinary and functional. It was not new, but it was familiar. The crossing ahead was considered routine, one segment of a short trip over terrain that had been traversed many times before. Flight 571 departed Mendoza during the early afternoon of October 1972. The aircraft climbed gradually toward the Andes, following a westward track that paralleled established air corridors. Inside the cabin, the movement was steady. Conversation was casual. Some passengers looked through the windows as the land rose beneath them. Others rested. Cloud cover thickened as the aircraft approached the higher terrain. Peaks disappeared behind layers of white and gray. Visual landmarks became indistinct. From the cockpit, the crew relied increasingly on instruments, radio navigation, and elapsed time between known positions. The planned route required crossing a mountain pass and then descending toward Curacao, Chile. Standard practice involved estimating distance by speed and time once inside the cloud layer. Strong headwinds, however, can slow ground speed without being immediately obvious. This can cause an aircraft to be farther east than calculations suggest. At approximately 3 p.m., the crew believed they had already cleared the main ridge of the Andes. They requested permission from Chilean air traffic control to begin descent. Clearance was granted. The aircraft descended into dense cloud. Moments later, the ground rose unexpectedly. The first impact came from below, not ahead. The right wing struck a ridge and separated. The sudden loss destabilized the aircraft. The left wing tore away soon after. The fuselage continued forward, sliding and tumbling across snow and rock. The tail section broke off. The remaining body of the aircraft skidded down a steep slope like a sled before coming to rest on a glacier at approximately 3,600 meters above sea level. The movement stopped abruptly. Silence followed, broken by wind moving across the open metal frame. Of the 45 people on board, several died instantly from the impact. Others were injured or unconscious. The fuselage, partially intact, lay in a narrow valley surrounded by steep, snow-covered walls. Clouds closed over the site again from the air. Nothing was visible. The aircraft had not yet crossed the mountains. When the sliding stopped, the fuselage remained upright but torn open at both ends. Snow and fragments of luggage were scattered along the slope behind it. The tail section lay some distance uphill. The wings were gone. Wind moved freely through the broken cabin. Those who could move began checking others without instruction. Seats had collapsed forward. Metal supports were bent inward. Several passengers were pinned. Some were already dead. Others were breathing but unable to speak. The temperature was low and dropping. Survivors pulled the injured into the center aisle where the floor was most level. Coats and spare clothing were collected from bags and placed over those who were shaken. A few medical students improvised splints from seat parts and fabric. There were no proper supplies. Work was slow at the altitude. Simple movements caused shortness of breath. Outside, the landscape showed no signs of habitation. The valley was enclosed by steep slopes of snow and rock. There were no trees, no visible paths, no smoke or structures. The scale of the mountains made distance difficult to judge. Food was gathered and counted. The total was small: a few chocolate bars, bottles of wine, soft drinks, some snacks intended for the short flight. It was clear the amount would not last long. Rations were divided into small portions. As daylight faded, the cold intensified. The open ends of the fuselage were blocked with luggage and pieces of metal to reduce wind. Seats were pushed together to create a shared surface for warmth. Bodies were placed close side by side. Night came quickly in the valley. There was no artificial light. The injured groaned intermittently. Others remained awake, listening to the wind moving across the snow and the thin metal shell around them. No one outside knew their location. Morning light entered through the torn front of the fuselage. The sky was clear for the first time since the crash. Snowfields and ridgelines became visible in all directions. The valley extended only a short distance before narrowing into steeper slopes. There were no signs of roads or buildings. The altitude was evident in the sharpness of the air and the effort required to stand. Those who were able moved outside to survey the area. The fuselage rested on compacted snow, angled slightly downhill. Debris from the wings and tail was scattered behind them. Walking was slow and uncertain. Each step broke through the crust and sank several centimeters. Inside, attention returned to the injured. Several had died during the night from their wounds and exposure. The living were repositioned to reduce crowding. Jackets, seat cushions, and insulation were gathered to cover the floor. The interior began to resemble a single shared shelter rather than a row of seats. There was no formal leader, but roles formed quickly. Some searched the wreckage for supplies. Others tended to the injured. A few focused on organizing food. Small pieces of chocolate were divided with care. Caps from bottles were used to measure melted snow for drinking water. Snow was collected in metal fragments and placed in sunlight to melt. Later, Aluminum parts from the aircraft were shaped into shallow containers to speed the process. Each task required time and repetition. By midday, they located the aircraft's radio equipment. Several attempted to power it using remaining batteries, hoping to transmit their position. The system responded briefly, then failed. Wires had been damaged during the crash. Repairs proved difficult without tools or technical knowledge throughout the day. The work continued without discussion of long-term plans. The focus remained immediate: warmth, water, small amounts of food, and the care of the injured. Routine began to replace shock. The valley remained quiet, except for the wind. During the first days, the remaining food was rationed with precision. Each person received small portions at fixed intervals: fragments of chocolate, a sip of wine, a piece of candy, sometimes nothing more than melted snow. The intention was to extend supplies long enough for search aircraft to locate them at intervals. They heard distant engine noise and stepped outside to signal with clothing or reflective metal. Planes passed high overhead, moving along established corridors. None altered course. Against the scale of the mountains, the white fuselage blended into the snow. By the end of the first week, the food was gone. There were no plants at that altitude. No animals were visible. The surrounding slopes were covered entirely by snow and ice. Attempts to chew leather or fabric provided no nourishment. Hunger became constant and physical. Standing caused dizziness. Walking required rest after short distances. Caloric loss was accelerated by cold. The body consumed energy simply to maintain temperature. Weight declined rapidly. Faces grew hollow. Speech slowed. The reality of their position became increasingly clear. Rescue might take weeks, or it might not come at all. Without a source of food, survival time was limited. The bodies of those who had died in the crash remained preserved in the snow outside the fuselage. The cold prevented decomposition. They were companions, friends, and relatives. Their presence had been treated with quiet respect. No one had disturbed them. The subject arose gradually, without announcement. Several survivors later described the conversation as restrained and practical. They discussed mountaineering accidents and historical accounts in which the dead had provided sustenance to the living. The situation was considered in terms of necessity rather than choice. Most of the group shared a Catholic upbringing. Some interpreted the decision through religious reasoning, comparing it to an act of communion or mutual sacrifice. Others framed it simply as survival. There was no alternative food source. After hesitation, small portions were cut and dried in the sun to preserve them. Distribution was measured and controlled. Nothing was wasted. The decision was recorded later with clarity by many survivors. It was not described as impulsive. It was deliberate, discussed, and accepted as the only available means to extend life. Work resumed the next day. After the first portions were consumed, the immediate weakness caused by starvation eased slightly. The effect was limited but noticeable. Movements became steadier. Thinking cleared. The body, receiving protein and fat, stabilized enough to continue basic tasks. The change did not bring comfort. It brought time. Days began to follow a simple structure. At first light, snow was collected and melted. Containers fashioned from aluminum fragments were arranged to capture sunlight. Water was shared in small amounts. The injured were checked. Bandages were adjusted using strips of fabric. Frostbite was monitored. Outside the fuselage, the snow surface hardened during the night and softened again by midday. Salvage teams walked carefully to the scattered wreckage. From the tail section they recovered blankets, seat covers, and pieces of insulation. Foam padding was removed from cushions and packed along the interior walls to reduce drafts. Suitcases were stacked to block openings. The narrow tube of the cabin became more enclosed. Sunglasses were improvised from plastic visors and wire to prevent snowblindness. Gloves were made from layered cloth. Small practical solutions accumulated, each one minor on its own, but together extending endurance. Time was tracked loosely. Some scratched marks into metal. Others estimated days by the cycle of light and dark. Watches stopped in the cold. Dates became uncertain. Food preparation followed a routine. Portions were cut thin and dried on metal surfaces in the sun to prevent freezing. Distribution was equal. The process was quiet and systematic, treated like any other task required for survival. Conversation remained measured. Energy was conserved. People spoke when necessary. Many spent long periods sitting still, watching the light move across the valley walls. Occasionally aircraft were heard in the distance. Signals were made without expectation. The sound faded quickly. The environment changed little. Wind patterns shifted. Snow drifted against the fuselage and had to be cleared to keep the entrance open. At night, temperatures dropped sharply, forcing everyone closer together for warmth. Work defined each day. Without it, cold and hunger returned more quickly. The routine did not improve their situation, but it prevented collapse. Several days after the crash, The group succeeded in powering a small radio recovered from the cockpit area. Batteries had been gathered and tested one by one. Wiring was adjusted until a faint signal emerged through static. The device could receive but not transmit. They listened in shifts. Broadcasts came intermittently from stations in Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. Music, news, routine announcements. The voices sounded distant and ordinary, part of a world that continued without interruption. For a time, the survivors assumed that search aircraft were actively scanning the mountains and that their location would soon be identified. Then, during one of the listening periods, a news bulletin mentioned the missing flight. The report stated that after several days of searching, authorities had suspended operations. The aircraft was presumed lost. Further efforts were considered unlikely to succeed. The statement was brief and procedural. No further details followed. The information was repeated quietly inside the fuselage. There was no visible reaction beyond stillness. The meaning was practical. If search teams had stopped, discovery would depend on their own action. After that day, the sound of aircraft engines carried less expectation. Signals were still attempted out of habit, but without urgency. Time stretched, without an external schedule. Days merged. Weather patterns became the only markers. Sunlight meant work outside. Cloud meant remaining inside. Snowfall required clearing the entrance repeatedly to prevent burial. Physical changes continued. Weight declined across the group. Beards grew. Clothing loosened. Small injuries healed slowly. The effort of walking even short distances at altitude caused breathlessness and headaches. Some began to climb the nearby slopes to study the surrounding terrain. Each ascent revealed more mountains, similar in appearance, extending outward in every direction. No road or settlement was visible. The scale of the landscape made orientation difficult. The wreckage remained the only fixed point by late October. The assumption of quick rescue had disappeared. Survival was no longer measured in days, but in uncertain weeks. The valley returned to its quiet state, unchanged. On the night of the 29th of October, weather conditions shifted without warning. Wind increased after sunset. Snow began to fall steadily, then heavily, covering the fuselage and the surrounding slope. Those inside reinforced the openings with luggage and insulation as they had done before. During storms, the interior grew darker and colder. Most lay down close together to conserve heat. Snow accumulated against the sides of the aircraft, pressing inward. The sound was gradual and muffled. Sometime after midnight, a mass of snow detached from the slope above. The avalanche struck the fuselage directly, burying it within seconds. Snow forced through the open rear and front, filling the interior. People were pushed forward and downward. The space compressed. Breathing became difficult as loose. Snow packed around faces and chests. Several survivors later described the sensation as being submerged. Those near the center fought to keep small air pockets open with their hands. Others were trapped beneath seats and bodies. Movement was limited. Darkness was complete. After the slide settled, the fuselage was entirely covered. Only a small volume of air remained inside. Survivors dug blindly with their hands and pieces of metal, clearing space around their mouths and those nearby. Work was slow due to exhaustion and lack of oxygen. By morning, they managed to create a narrow tunnel to the surface. 8 people had suffocated during the night, including some who had survived the initial crash and the weeks that followed. Among the dead was Marcelo Perez, who had informally coordinated many tasks since the beginning. The loss reduced their number. Significantly, bodies were moved outside and placed in the snow with the others. The entrance was re-established. Interior space was cleared again. The storm passed, leaving a smooth white surface across the valley. The routine resumed, but the group was smaller and quieter. After the avalanche, remaining inside the fuselage felt less secure. The shelter had preserved them, but it had also nearly become a sealed container. Several began to argue that waiting alone was no longer sufficient. If rescue would not arrive, they would need to reach help themselves. Small teams started testing the surrounding slopes. The first attempts were brief. 2 or 3 survivors would climb for several hours carrying minimal supplies. Progress was slow. The snow crust broke underfoot, forcing each step deep into the surface. At altitude, breathing became labored within minutes. Headaches and nausea followed. Sunlight reflecting off the snow caused eye strain even with improvised goggles. From higher ground, the view expanded but offered little clarity. Peaks overlapped one another in every direction. Valleys curved out of sight. What had seemed like a nearby ridge from below often required hours to approach. On one early attempt, a group reached a crest expecting to see lower terrain beyond. Instead, they saw only more mountains of similar height. The realization altered their assumptions about distance. They had not crashed near the edge of the range, but they were deep inside it. They returned to the fuselage before nightfall, exhausted and with frost forming on clothing. Subsequent attempts were planned more carefully. with extra clothing and measured food. Even so, each journey ended the same way: limited progress, rapid fatigue, and retreat. The wreckage remained their base. Time continued to thin their strength. By early December, nearly 2 months had passed since the crash. The group understood that remaining in place through another winter cycle would reduce their chances further. A longer expedition was proposed, not to scout nearby ridges but to commit to crossing the range. 3 volunteers prepared for the attempt: Fernando, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin. Peredo had recovered from severe injuries sustained in the crash and had gradually become one of the strongest walkers. Canessa was a medical student. Vicentin had experience in physical endurance. The selection was based on condition rather than authority. Preparation took several days. From seat covers and insulation foam, they constructed a makeshift sleeping bag large enough for shared warmth at night. Small quantities of dried meat were wrapped in plastic. Extra clothing was layered. The others provided what materials they could spare. On the 12th of December 1972, the 3 men left the fuselage and began climbing westward. The first ascent was steep and slow. Each step required deliberate placement. The snow surface alternated between crust and soft powder. Progress that would take minutes at sea level required hours. They stopped frequently to rest and regulate breathing. After reaching a high ridge, they expected to see descending terrain toward Chile. Instead, they saw additional peaks extending outward. The scale of the mountains was greater than anticipated. The crossing would be longer than planned. After several days, supplies were insufficient for 3. Vicentin returned to the fuselage with remaining food, leaving Parado and Canessa to continue with reduced weight. The 2 proceeded along ridgelines and down into narrow valleys, walking for most of each day. Nights were spent inside the shared sleeping bag, sheltered behind rocks when possible. The landscape gradually changed. Snow thinned. Patches of exposed ground appeared. They kept moving west. On the 20th of December, after 10 days of travel, Parado and Canessa descended into a lower valley where vegetation began to appear along a stream. Later that day, they saw a mounted herder on the opposite bank. The distance and the sound of water prevented conversation. Notes were written on paper and attached to a stone, which was thrown across. The message explained the crash and the location of the remaining survivors. The herder, Sergio Catalan, rode to the nearest settlement to notify authorities. Within 24 hours, search aircraft were airborne again. On the 22nd of December, helicopters approached the glacier where the fuselage remained. The sound carried across the valley before the aircraft were visible. Survivors stepped outside and waited in an open area, marked with clothing. 2 flights were required due to altitude and weight limits. The first carried the most fragile. The second returned for the rest. The valley returned to silence. After the helicopters departed, 16 of the original 45 people survived. They were treated in Chilean hospitals and later returned to Uruguay. Investigations confirmed the navigational error and the location of the crash deep within the Andes. In the months that followed, the survivors described their methods with restraint and factual clarity. The site remained unchanged, gradually covered by seasonal snow. The event entered historical record as an instance of prolonged human endurance under isolation.